wherever you are joining us from around the world. We're so happy that you could join us today. And I'm sure that there will be some folks that join us over the next few minutes. But in the meantime, please feel free to drop in the chat where in the world you are joining us from. I think that we have folks from a number of different locations in the US and in some other continents. So please feel free to drop where you are joining us from around the world, and we'll get to know each other a little bit. Uh, we are recording this webinar, and we will send everyone who registered for the webinar a copy of the recording. We will turn the recording off when we get to the Q&A. That will be a Q&A just for those of us who are live, so just so that you know about the recording. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Lynn Kripe, and I am CEO of the Conterra Group. And Conterra has been providing mental health and workplace-based programs to disaster response organizations and other organizations working in high-stakes contexts for nearly 20 years. Personally, I've responded to a number of different disasters over the course of my career, including the Indian Ocean tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, the Haiti earthquake, the Nepal earthquake, and I've supported a host of other disasters and crises. And I'm joined by my good colleague, Raven. And Raven, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everybody, and thank you for coming. It's nice to see you all. I am the Director of Clinical Operations with the Conterra Group. I'm also a licensed professional counselor, and I've been providing therapy and program oversight for 20 years, with a significant portion of my work really around supporting federal organizations as they respond to natural disasters and other crises. And some of that support has been through deployment and providing those counseling services, and other times it's been leading teams of mental health professionals who were supporting the deployed staff. And I have been in direct responses for Hurricane Isaac and Matthew, and also coordinated the large-scale mental health service delivery during Harvey, Maria, and Irma. It's nice
Great,
to be with you
thanks.
guys.
Thanks, Raven. Um, and as you've heard from our introductions, we're both coming to today's discussion from our personal experience, but more importantly, from our professional experience, supporting many responders to many different kinds of disasters in the US and around the world. And as we dive into our conversation today, we really want to invite you to freely use the chat for questions or comments or engagement with our discussion today. We'll reserve our Q&A for the end, but my colleague Allison Giffen, Conterra's Director of Strategy and Growth, is going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll capture those questions so that we can tackle them as we come to the end. If for any reason you'd prefer to ask your question privately and not to the full group chat, feel free to send a private message to Allison. Just search for her name in the chat, and she'll track it that way. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. When we talk about disaster readiness, we often talk about it in terms of logistics or staffing or supplies. But as we all know, disaster response depends on people, on human beings who are operating under pressure. And even highly capable, highly experienced responders can find themselves affected by the cumulative stress of multiple deployments, by moral strain, moral injury, exhaustion, as well as re-entry challenges. And here in the US, where Raven, Allison, and I are all physically sitting at the moment, we're heading into hurricane season, tornado season, and the summer wildfire season has already begun. And all of us are aware how natural disasters due to climate change are becoming more frequent and more severe. We also, I'm sure, have all been tracking the news about the Ebola outbreak in DRC and Uganda and the seriousness with which that outbreak appears to be. And what all of that demonstrates is that disaster responders are called on more than ever. And we need responders to be able to fulfill their mission and remain psychologically healthy while they're responding. And over the next 54 minutes, we want to share some practical ways drawn from our experience that responder readiness can be strengthened and ways that organizations can really implement that immediately. It's not something that has to take a lot of planning time, but there are ways that organizations can strengthen their readiness even for this upcoming hurricane and wildfire season. So, as we think about how we can support the psychological readiness for disaster responders, what we want to keep front and center is that the goal of support is better performance. And so, what does that look like when we think about disaster responders that are doing their job well, are performing well? What's that profile look like? And from our perspective, what we want to see are people who are capable of acting and thinking in ways that support the mission. We want people to be able to do their jobs effectively, to exercise good judgment and decision making, something that we know can be compromised when people have unregulated stress or levels of stress and distress that really exceed their ability to manage. It might look like less burnout or more constructive interpersonal and working relationships and healthier transitions after deployment that support longevity. But fundamentally, what we want to see is people perform as well at the end of their deployment as they do at the beginning of their deployment. And so as we've talked about this a little bit, would love to have you drop in the chat. What are some of the characteristics of performance that you want to see from your responders? When you think about disaster responders who are performing well, what does that look like for you? We'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And so, as we think about this profile of people who are performing well, some people may be able to do that without support. However, what our experience has been is that organizations that prepare their people and not just their plans perform better over time. And this is particularly true when you think about repeated deployments and the stress that that can cause for staff and volunteers. And so we want to share some of the lessons that we've learned over the past near 20 years about how organizations can support their responders. And where we'd like to begin is to talk about what is the reality of deployment for disaster responders, and to dive a little bit more deeply into what people face at each stage of the deployment process. And as we describe this, we're going to mention a number of things, but if there are things that you have observed or experienced, please feel free to supplement our comments with your comments in the chat. And so when we think about the pre-deployment stage, what happens before people respond to a disaster? This period we often think about as a time that is typically hectic and full of a lot of ambiguity. Deployments are often very, very quick. And so people don't have the same kind of time to prepare, gather their logistics and packing that they might for other kinds of travel. And they're having to handle all of these logistics while also mentally preparing for what they might encounter. We're going to thanks. We're going to ask everybody to keep themselves muted. Thanks so much for that. The thing is that in a disaster, people may not know what they're going to encounter. They may not know fully what the circumstances on the ground is going to be like. Um, they may not even have full clarity about what specific role they're going to be playing. And so, what people may be experiencing is sort of a soup of adrenaline, uncertainty, some anticipatory anxiety. And the thing that many of us know to be true is that disaster responders may enjoy and even thrive in some of that space of adrenaline and uncertainty. However, for our loved ones, they may not enjoy it in the same way that the responders do. And so, along with everything that responders are having to manage for themselves, they may also need to be managing the concerns of their loved ones and the logistics of their household in light of a sudden deployment. So, think about you're getting ready to deploy, but your spouse or partner had a medical appointment, an important medical appointment that you are meant to accompany them to next week while you're going to be gone. Or maybe you're co-parenting and it was next week, it was your week to have the kids. And so now both parents are having to scramble to figure out those logistics. And this swirl of emotions and logistics can be magnified for first time responders, and experienced responders may notice unresolved experiences from prior deployments might arise if there's some similarities or what they're expecting to head into echoes prior difficult experiences. And to share some of what this looked like in my own experience in thinking back to the 2010 Haiti earthquake response, it really epitomized this dynamic of rapidity and ambiguity. Deployment was very rapid. As the needs evolved, we tried to get people out the door as soon as was humanly possible. And initially, that included all of the typical technical expertise, but we came to discover that we were going to need finance people, we were going to need procurement folks, and so we had to prepare folks who weren't necessarily accustomed to deploying to that rapid pace of deployment. And as we were preparing folks, people didn't necessarily know where they would be lodging, much less what they would encounter on the ground. And family members, of course, were concerned about the safety of their loved ones as aftershocks continued. And we didn't know what kind of communication would be possible during the employment. And of course, our Haitian colleagues who had experienced devastating losses were also deploying. And so for them, they skipped from the pre-deployment right into the response as survivors. And Raven's going to talk a little bit more about that during deployment phase.
Thank you, Lynn. And I think that part of when we're thinking about what happens during deployment is we need to really reflect on it and go back to that piece of what Lynn is saying about that we are moving very quickly. People are doing the work that they are passionate about, and there's a lot of adrenaline. And so when folks get onto site or into the field, part of what we see is sometimes like first of all, that understanding of the need to move quickly kind of in their work, but also that piece of being completely overwhelmed by the actual landscape and the environment and the impact that the disasters had on that community. What we know is disasters fundamentally change communities. And for some folks, it might be that this is the fourth time that they've seen it, but it also might be the very first time that they're seeing it for new deployers. And it can really be overstimulating in that moment. The other things that we know is that folks are working very, very long hours, and that is really about accomplishing the goals of the deployment and providing the most support that they can during that time and figuring out that piece of how do they continue to do the work and keep up their level of energy with those long hours. There is also a exposure to intense grief and loss. People are sometimes hearing hundreds of stories per day of people who have lost everything. During my deployments within um, within the hurricane system, kind of supporting FEMA, those folks are taking in a ton of information. So they're coming into their consultations with us, really having heard more stories of grief and loss in a short period of time than what they ever have. And so that's really something that has become challenging and overwhelming. And they're starting to have the experiences of vicarious trauma. I think the other parts is kind of that really there's a lot of change in our ability to manage our self-care as we normally would, because you're in a new environment that doesn't have kind of the structure that we would normally have in our regular work. And so really trying to figure out those pieces of how do I continue to take care of myself during this time while I continue to focus on the work that we're trying to do. I think also when we think about this other piece is that I think, and Lynn also talked about this, like the process of preparing our family members. Sometimes we do different types of, sometimes we're really good at preparing our families, and sometimes we've not done as good of a job as we would normally want to do. And so there is also, while folks are in the midst of providing the support, really this component of also trying to manage family expectations, concerns, and what is their role within the family, and how does that change because they are in that part of response. And so they're kind of having to balance those two pieces of their lives. And Len, if we want to start talking about post-deployment, and I think for many of us is there's this excitement and this happiness about being home. And then also that piece of coming down from the pace of the deployment. And kind of how do you manage that? How am I dealing with that part? How am I dealing with that change in pace? How am I reacclimating? And that component of everyone kind of giving you the information that aren't you glad to be back? And the answer to that is always yes, I'm glad to be back. And the understanding of the transition is hard and can be very difficult. And how do you kind of have those conversations around that component of it? And I know for me, that was something that was also pretty delayed. It didn't come right when you got back home. There was a time when there was a delay in the time you started feeling those things, and other people had already moved on, but you were having a pretty hard time with that adjustment and the adapting. And Len, do you have other things to share about post-deployment?
Yeah, I think what something you and I have talked about from our own experience directly, but also supporting folks who have been through intense deployments, is that sometimes that sort of mixed emotions, whether it comes immediately after or delayed, can be surprising to them. Like, why am I so crabby with folks? Or, I got a little time off and was able to rest, but why am I so tired? And so if we can help people understand what that trajectory can look like or might look like for them, that's a real service to people. And it's one way that we can contribute to preventing attrition among responders as well. When they know what to expect, then that can help keep them in as responders, whether as staff or volunteers, for longer. And what we've described, if we take a step back and think about this experience of deployment stress from pre all the way through post deployment, we might go, holy cow, that's a lot. And it is. And this is just the reality of the deployment. the argument that we're making today is not that we need to try to change that reality of the stress of the deployment, but rather that this is expected and it's not extraordinary. As we've been talking, I've seen some people nodding and demonstrating that this resonates. And so the question really becomes, if this is the reality of a deployment, if a deployment is an inherently stressful experience, then how do organizations support their staff and volunteers over the course of this expected but stressful event? And what we have found is that the support works best when it is proactive, so you're not waiting for a crisis to occur, when it's normalized, that we're talking about this is a risk, like risks to physical safety that you need to be thinking about and need to be preparing for. The support works best when it's integrated into the deployment process and doesn't somehow sit outside of it, but it's one of the things that you do along with everything else, and that it's well timed. And so, what do we mean by this? What we have found is that there are two particularly strategic points of influence for effective support to responders. The first is in the preparation period, and the second is in recovery or post deployment. While Conterra, our experience is that we will often make during deployment support available to people, most responders don't need or won't take advantage of support during the deployment because of the operational tempo. They have their own resources. There is often sort of built-in support and community within a responding team. And so we found that bookending deployments with support is particularly strategic. And so what we would like to highlight for the remainder of our time together is two tools that we have found to be particularly helpful at these points of strategic influence. And the first is the role of individual consultations, both pre and post deployment. And the second is the Conterra Inventory of Resilience Builders, or CURB, which is a tool that we've developed over the last few years that can be used to provide insight and strengthen behaviors that support the psychological health of responders.
So, as Lynn mentioned, pre-deployment consultations is really where the psychological support starts for in preparation for deployment. For Conterra, what we have found is our pre-deployment consultations are provided individually. They're also confidential and are approximately 45 to 50 minutes long. They're also provided by licensed mental health professionals who have experience supporting responders and deployers. And many of them have also deployed themselves. And so they're able to bring with them that professional expertise, plus that personal understanding to their consultations and their conversations with folks. And I think for a lot of organizations, it's like kind of that piece of who is this available for? And so we believe that it's really most helpful to provide the support to everyone, whether that be staff, volunteers, but also leaders of teams that do the deploying, because then everybody kind of has that preparation psychologically for what they're getting ready to step into. We also find that that piece of individual support as opposed to group support is very, very important because it gives folks a place where they can really have the candid conversations about fears, concerns, and vulnerabilities without the worry that admitting that they have these feelings and admitting that the emotion, the anxiety, and the without the kind of that fear of admitting that anxiety and uncertainty is going to cause others to question whether or not they are really prepared to do the work or for the deployment. The other kind of part of this is that we know that when you're getting ready to deploy, a lot of time and energy is spent on the preparation for where I'm going to go, who I'm going to help, how am I going to support the team, and not really on ourselves. The pre-deployment consultation really gives a couple of moments for folks to really focus on themselves, their own needs, their thoughts, their emotions, um, and kind of thinking about what their experience is going to be. In addition, I think Lynn kind of mentioned this piece earlier. We know and understand that this is not going to eliminate stress or the emotional response. Those are part of the work that we're doing when we are providing support in disasters. Really, the goal is for us to have staff and deployers and responders who have a greater awareness and preparedness for what the work they're going to do, some realistic expectations, and a clear understanding of how to support themselves while supporting others. We know that when responders are better prepared, both emotionally and psychologically, they're really better able to sustain themselves. They're able to support their teams better, and they're better able to continue to do the work over time. The counselors are going to kind of do those pieces of really that exploring of the emotions, um, and really that piece of exploring concerns and emotions while having already done the work of really customizing their consultation to the event and to the individual, which does require us to kind of get to know that person pretty well kind of in those open sessions. So it's that piece of understanding their role, understanding their previous experience, understanding what they've already done to prepare to go on this deployment, and then kind of stepping slowly into what are your concerns and emotions around this? What are the things that you are thinking about the most, whether that be about the witnessing of the devastation or about anxiety being around away from your family, uncertainty of your roles, or that concern about how you perform under pressure. Us having that open conversation with them, hopefully they'll be able to process some of that, but also it's really about having that awareness of what they're like the awareness of how they are doing as they're stepping into this new um, moment in time and new and more complex work than what they do on a daily basis. The other part of this is really about kind of that plan. What does it look like to take care of yourself successfully while you're on deployment? Um, we are all aware that we have coping mechanisms that we do in our regular lives. When we are deployed, most of us do not have access to be able to do them in the same ways that we would. So we are losing kind of our exercise routines, we're losing privacy, we're losing downtime. And so, what are the ways that we really adjust our own expectations of ourselves and start to identify realistic ways to take care of ourselves in this imperfect and demanding environment? There's also time, of course, to talk about how do we have these realistic conversations with family about what it's going to look like because this is not a regular work trip, and also answering practical questions. And those practical questions, I know for me, when I've done consultations, can range from I know that I'm going to have difficult conversations with survivors of the events. How would you do that in that time? What are the things that you have found more helpful? And then also some things that are very practical, about kind of like what would you bring and what things have you found most helpful? Because most folks do have that understanding that we've also been responders or that we've deployed. The ultimate goal of these consultations is really about making sure that folks feel more prepared, more confident, and more grounded in their purpose as they go into their deployment. And then I'm going to pass it on to you.
Great, thank you. So Raven has done such a nice job talking about the first tool of pre-deployment consultations. And we would next like to share a little bit about the CURB, the Conterra Inventory of Resilience Builders. And this is a tool that we developed a few years ago when we looked around and we just assessed that the current tools that exist to support the resilience of people that do disaster response, other kind of humanitarian work, were just incomplete. And so we have found that the curb can be very useful paired with consultations. It can inform consultations. People take an assessment that is confidential and private, and they get then information back about how they rate on 10 factors that are quite fundamental to resilience. And so they get a sense of what their own resilience profile is. They get a personalized report of that, access to short video lessons, and some practical tools and worksheets that allow them to dive deeper in those areas where there are some opportunities for growth. And so we have found that it can be quite helpful for disaster responders to take the curb before an assessment. Their provider then can use that as a basis for conversation and really tying the consultation back to their current situation in the moment, because our resilience factors do change and flux over time. And to then think very concretely and practically, as Raven was mentioning, about what are some of the things that you can do on this next deployment that will support your resilience, whether it's in terms of positive coping, whether it's related to sleep, nutrition, positive outlook, and get very concrete and specific in light of the unique realities that they'll face on the upcoming deployment. We've also found that this can be helpful for teams. So while the individual results remain confidential, there is a way for us to provide a snapshot of what is happening across a team. For example, many people on this responding team are low when it comes to sleep, or low when it comes to emotional regulation. And that can be very helpful information for leaders to think about how do we need to better support this team so that they can fulfill their mission and have stamina as a responder over time. It also allows the team to develop some shared language around resilience, which can be very helpful going forward. Our experience is that it allows teams to have more constructive conversations when somebody may be struggling, rather than just saying, oh, well, that person is being a jerk or that person is problematic. It gives teams some different language to describe what might be happening. Oh, perhaps their resilience has been degraded over time because of what they have experienced. So in that pre-deployment phase, we'd really love for you to take away the idea of the value of pre-deployment consultations, the role that the curb can have in terms of insight and awareness, linked to then very practical coping strategies.
And then we also have the recognition that post-deployment consultations are really an essential part of responder support. They have kind of a very similar structure to the pre-deployment consultation, as then they're one individual and they are confidential. And where the pre-deployment consultation really helps to prepare the responders for the work and for being in the field. The post-deployment consultation helps them to process their experience and supports that transition to home or either to the next deployment. One of the important parts of this conversation is really that the mental health professionals that we're working with really create a space to process those deployment experiences that is very structured and supportive so folks feel that they can be open about their experience. And we typically have the same person doing pre and post, so it also allows the counselor to facilitate a review of themes that were discussed in that first meeting and bring that back to the post consultation to find out a little bit about how did you see those concerns? Um, how did they play out while you were on your deployment, or did they play out at all? There's often also a time really when the responders again are going to be able to talk about what their expectations were versus their true experience. Um, and also speak really honestly about the emotions that may have emerged during the deployment. Some of them that you might have talked about before, but some of them might be unexpected. So, was there a lot of grief or sadness or guilt and helplessness or numbness? And why did some things possibly trigger a very, very strong emotion when maybe in past deployments or in the past they've not had that response? The post-deployment consultation also doesn't just focus on kind of those emotions. I think for many of us who have done this type of deployment work, whether it be to natural disasters or other types of crisis, what we realize also is that doing that intensive and hard work really can be a time when we have some meaning building about how about ourselves professionally and personally. Um, and the post-deployment consultation can give folks the opportunity to really start to come to some awareness about that. They can look at what strengths they developed over their deployment, what things that they learned, and how they adapt under pressure. But also it gives a lot of times folks the ability to really reconnect with that strong sense of purpose, and why they do the work that they do. The final kind of piece of this is really about how do I transition back home? And how do I reestablish really those routines around sleep, exercise, self-care? I think as Lynn kind of talked about the curb, it's like if folks have taken the curb, looking back at where are kind of those strength sets for me, and how do I shift from the intensity of my deployment back into my responsibilities and relationships between and work and family, which also may have a level of intensity too, but it is very, very different. And really us helping them and supporting the clients and the staff that we see with that reintegration and recovery from their deployment. We really want them folks also, if they are going to be redeployed, really to be ready for what that next deployment is going to look like and modify any self-care plans that maybe did or did not work during that time. The other kind of that last component of that, I'm sorry, Lynn. I keep on saying the last, and I was like, that's not the last. Is that piece of sometimes we do make recommendations. If folks have had a particularly challenging deployment, they may need ongoing support, whether that be peer support, ongoing counseling, or us to identify other resources. And that allows us to really be proactive in making those referrals and doing that early, prior to it becoming something more significant. I In this kind of diagram, what we're showing really is how the three support services really kind of work together. The curb really increases awareness and provides information. That pre-deployment consultation is really an individual, is a time where folks can focus individually on what they need to do to maintain self-care and what they would like to get from their deployment and how do they kind of support their multiple roles that they're going to still be playing with family. And then, of course, that post-deployment consultation, like we were talking about earlier, is that piece of kind of wrapping up their experience, understanding what happened, bringing that awareness to what happened, creating new plans for self-care, and being able to transition back into home. And I think when you look at back into that curve, it's like, how do we use the information that they've gathered from the curve to really think about all of those components during each of the consultations?
Great. Thanks so much, Raven. Um, so if your organization is expecting to respond during hurricane season, wildfire season to the Ebola outbreak in sub-Saharan Africa, now is really the time to prepare the people that will be carrying out that work. And if any of this has resonated with you today, we'd love to talk with you about what that support could look like given your particular deployment cadence, given the kinds of events and disasters that your teams respond to, and what some enhanced support could look like for your team. And so if you're interested in learning more, we'd love to talk with you further about that. And you can feel free to use the QR code to book a discovery call right away. I'm also going to drop a link where you can go to a calendar to book that at your convenience, and we can start some conversation about that. We'd love to let you know about 2 upcoming webinars that we have in June before we turn to Q&A. We're quite excited to, in just a few weeks, have another disaster-focused webinar where we're really going to highlight the issue of leadership and supporting resilient leadership. And Miriam, you made a comment earlier today, earlier in the chat, where you highlighted how much you think about leaders who can lead effectively. And so we're going to be hosting a webinar on June 17th that will really take a closer look at that issue. And then on June 24th, we're going to be hosting a webinar really looking at the issue of teams that work with graphic content and what do organizations need to know to protect their people, performance, and decision making, all of which can be compromised when people are exposed to graphic content on a regular basis. That might be visual images that are disturbing. It could be auditory material. It could be online speech and words. So if either of those apply to you, please keep an eye on our LinkedIn feed where we will make announcements. And I'm never very good at multitasking and like grabbing content while I'm talking, but I'm going to try to grab the links, the registration links to both those, so that if you wanted to go ahead and register now, even before those public announcements, please feel free to do that. We do have a few minutes for questions, and we'd love to hear from you what you're thinking. Were there questions that came up for you as we were talking, and as you're gathering your thoughts about that? We just love to close by re-emphasizing that our experience supporting disaster responders over the last 20 years really demonstrates that when organizations prepare their responders psychologically prior to deployment and support them in a planful transition as they're heading out of their response mode, that this has a number of benefits for the organization, including better performance and functioning of the responders during the deployment, higher retention, learning within the organization, and most fundamentally, fulfilling your duty of care to your staff and volunteers who are taking on unusual risks that not everybody in the public does. And so we're so pleased that you joined us today and carved out an hour of your time for this conversation. Very happy to answer any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or drop your question in the chat. And we're going to stop the recording at this point.